This is your World War III update. Here's what's going on. Big news. Iran has closed its airspace once again. Now, if you're dialed into this Middle Eastern conflict, you'll know that this is not breaking news. In fact, they've closed the airspace for approximately the last 24 hours or so. The reason why this is so significant is the size of the airspace closure. Effectively, everything in the part of the country that really matters, with the exception of things that are happening east of the Caspian, because of course these are going to be the flight paths into the country if Israel was, or the Americans were, to do another major attack. Iran ran the risk last time of shooting down commercial airliners because they were blindsided by an attack. They don't want to make that mistake again. They don't want commercial airliners to be used as human shields, which was something that I think is very understated in terms of the strategy employed by the Israelis in the first initial decapitation strike. Yes, there were cyber attacks, there were Mossad saboteurs on the ground that compromised Iranian air defense, but an often overlooked handicap that the Iranians had was that there were commercial planes flying really close, if not in Iranian airspace at the time. They don't want to make the same mistake they made back in early 2020 when they shot down a commercial jetliner thinking that it was an enemy aircraft. Now, if this was just an exercise, which some people are claiming this is related to, these notice to airmen would be circumscribed to much smaller regions, because this is something which is economically detrimental to have your entire, airspace closed down. So this is not something they would do unless they thought that an attack was imminent. And they have learned that the strategy of Israel and the United States is to, whenever there is some pivotal diplomatic engagement plan, be it a meeting between leaders, and the outcome of said meeting is supposed to be what determines the course of action thereafter. Well, they've kind of caught on to these perfidious tactics that have been utilized by Israel and the United States, in that in almost every attack, be it the pager attack, being it the attack in Syria, the initial decapitation attempt by the Israelis, or the stealth bomber attack by the United States, in the run-up to all of those, there was always this prospective, pivotal diplomatic engagement which was supposed to determine the course of action thereafter. And of course, the Iranians would always be blindsided by, because they were expecting that they had a bit more time to prepare. Well, Benjamin Netanyahu is supposed to go to the White House on Monday. So I suspect that the Iranians have probably caught on, possibly through their own channels. Maybe the Russians are more sympathetic to the cause now that Azerbaijan is apparently compromised by the West from their point of view, and they're now disavowing more intelligence which could potentially compromise the Israeli strike plans. Thus, Iran is now shutting down its entire airspace. I suspect it's because they expect a major attack is coming. Now, when do these attacks usually happen? Because Trump doesn't want to disturb the markets, and we know that Trump and Netanyahu are always in cahoots, regardless of what performative diplomacy and enmity exists in the media. We know that they're always on the same side, so it's very unlikely that this is going to happen throughout the week. In fact, all of these attacks typically come on the weekend, usually Friday night, late Friday night, North American time, or sometimes Saturday, to give the markets a little time to process so they don't spook the markets and trigger the algorithms and send everything hurtling to zero. So I suspect that's what this is. You're seeing a lot of performative stuff in the media. Like right now, you're hearing the United States insist that these nuclear facilities have been obliterated. I even seen this discombobulated, chopped up, overly edited interview. I believe it was with ABC News and the Iranian foreign minister, where he's allegedly saying that damage to the nuclear facilities was very severe. But it was jump cut to all hell, so it was heavily edited. So, did he go on to say after that, things have not been, destroyed or obliterated? We don't know, because clearly they're trying to craft a narrative. They want the Iranians to think that they think that all is well now. But something about this closure means that the Iranians have caught on to this perfidious game that they're playing, whereby it appears as though the West is ready to move on from this. So why then is the Iranian airspace closed? They understand that the West is putting on a show. Okay, in fact, there's been an intel intercept that the Iranians, and this is what the U.S. administration is trying to downplay, that the Iranians have gotten caught stating that the damage is not that severe, okay, in the underground Fordow facility. In fact, they've been excavating it for some time now, despite the threats by the Israelis and the Americans that if you go back to this site without being chaperoned by the International Atomic Energy Agency, we will recommence our attacks. Now, as we speak at the time of making this video, they are currently excavating the Fordow facility. Okay, in fact, they are covering up the holes, or some of the holes that were the entry points, presumably by the massive ordnance penetrators. We're going to have an expert on tomorrow that's going to break down exactly what is going on with that and why, in the state of Iranian nuclear enrichment, and whether or not it's actually a credible threat. It most certainly is if you're Israel or the United States. We'll leave that conversation for tomorrow. But it's important to understand that the State Department has reiterated its travel advisory to Iran as a result of this. Now, typically, they're going to want to, cross all their T's and dot all their I's before they engage in another mission. And the question is, do they still have casus belli? Were they to carry out an attack today, how would they justify it in retrospect to the American people, considering they've now established a narrative that the Iranian nuclear program has been pushed back 1 to 2 years? Now, the reason why they're saying that is because they're trying to get the Iranians to put their guard down, because they're planning another major attack. How are they going to justify it? They're going to do the same thing that they basically came out and bragged about, how they put on this phony negotiations purely to lead the Iranians on so that they would let their guards down to make way for an attack. And they'll just say the same thing and everybody will buy it hook, line, and sinker. That's just the way it goes. We know that naval mines were loaded in June onto Iranian warships getting ready for the potential closure of the Strait of Hormuz. A lot of the Iranian ships left some of their main ports, and this perhaps was their strategic signaling towards the West that if you do X, we will do Y. Now, we know that the Israelis called for a ceasefire. Everybody has their different speculations as to why they might have done that. I think there is a consensus understanding that they were in fact running low on interceptors. The Iranians fired over 600 missiles and countless amounts of drones, and as such, this is going to drastically deplete your ability to intercept missiles, and these are very expensive. 15 to 20% of the THAAD interceptors were exhausted, and that's just in one theater of war. You still have the Saudis, who have THAAD systems that are now operational. You had them utilized in other parts of the world, and 15 to 20% over the course of 12 days is pretty substantial, considering they're only making a handful of these things every year. So I suspect that the reason why they paused is because they wanted to make sure that they weren't going to run out when this thing really starts up again. And they also, have escalation dominance, so they have the luxury of being the ones who are the instigators in this conflict. Whether you like it or not, the Israelis were the ones that attacked the Iranians. As far as I know, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, the Iranians have never actually sponsored terrorist attacks inside the United States. I went and I researched this the other night, thinking to myself, there's got to be at least one instance of Iran-backed terrorism in the United States, and there isn't one, surprisingly. I can't say the same, however, for Israel, and I believe it was the USS Liberty incident where the Israelis claimed they accidentally decided to, fire on the USS Liberty, which of course started war. So who can you really trust this day and age? I'll leave you to be the judge. I think you guys have the level of discernment required to know exactly what is going on here. And there's a reason why Iran has closed its airspace. There's a reason why air defense has been activated. They're currently still dealing with a lot of espionage in the country. They're cracking down on Mossad rings, there's acts of sabotage, there's attacks on residential facilities, assassination attempts on a daily basis. A lot of this stuff you're not going to hear in the news. All you're going to hear about is the big Arrow attack. Well, I'm telling you right now that the closure of this airspace signifies that they are expecting an attack. Now, by virtue of the fact that the airspace is now closed means that they're prepared, and that in itself might preclude any attack from happening. So I wouldn't be surprised that if nothing happens in this particular instance. We know if something's going to happen, it's likely going to happen when people don't expect it. It's all about the element of surprise. Iran is expelling foreigners in mass amid claims of Israeli espionage, has indicated that they've suspended cooperation entirely with the International Atomic Energy Agency, and that was formalized by presidential decree and ratified by the National Security Council. According to the Ayatollah, who, as it turns out, was fully in command of the Iranian military and the IRGC throughout the conflict, he claims that from the beginning, the U.S. has wanted Iran's surrender. Nuclear, human rights, missiles were always just an excuse, that the goal is regime change. This is something that myself and many guests on the channel have reiterated for the longest time. It has nothing to do with nuclear weapons. That's simply a means to an end. That's been a justification used in order to legitimate some form of intervention. Also, they're doing a crackdown on Starlink. So possessing or distributing Starlink or unlicensed internet tech is now considered a criminal offense. And they're also suspecting recent cyber attacks as a part of a broader hybrid war. Iranians claim to have hacked, I think, something like 100 million gigabytes worth of, or 100 gigabytes worth of Trump administration emails. So it will be interesting to see what emerges from that. As indicated, Benjamin Netanyahu is supposed to meet with Donald Trump on his fourth visit during the war on Monday, and typically an attack is going to precede said agreement because that's usually cover for a surprise attack, right? So this is what I think is one of the factors that is contributing to this highly irregular closure of airspace. The State Department has also approved another $500 million emergency arms sale to Israel, which is comprised of 3,800 JDAM kits with 2,000-pound bunker busters and 3,200 JDAM kits for 500-pound Mk-82 bombs. That's a lot of bombs considering Israel already has a massive arsenal. And I know they didn't drop that much ordnance on Iran in the last 12-day war, at least as far as we know. So I suspect that they're really getting ready for the big one, and they wanted this timeout so that they could regroup. After Fordow, Israeli sources hint at new strikes incoming. Iran's uranium enrichment will continue, says the foreign minister. Nobody knows exactly what's happening at Fordow, but the damage is very serious. So the Iranians are kind of playing along with this. But what we do know is that there have been plane load after plane load. In fact, in one day, there was something like 7 planes that all landed within a relatively short period of time. This was today, I guess, depending on what time zone you're in. So massive military shipments towards Israel are currently underway. We have, like I said, the Fordow facility is now being cleared out of debris so that it can be accessed. Craters are being backfilled, and it appears as though the facility is going to be operational once again soon. And of course, if you missed my video yesterday where I was talking about punctuated escalation, what we're going to see next is likely a step up the escalation ladder, in that what will happen now is because the best of the best didn't do the job What does that mean? Well, that means that they're either going to have to employ more asymmetrical style approaches to trying to take out the leadership, or they're going to use tactical nuclear weapons. Those are essentially the two options. Now, how are they going to work public opinion to facilitate this? Well, bipartisan lawmakers are proposing authorizing Trump to transfer B-2 stealth bombers with 30,000 pound bunker busters, which of course, if they didn't work the first time, they're not going to work again. Okay, and there's a limited quantity of these things, and I think they use, what did they use, like 14 the first time? Or was it 14? I guess each stealth bomber can only carry one because it's 30,000 pounds, and I think the payload capacity is 40,000 pounds, so maybe it wasn't that many. Either way, they only have a couple dozen of these things at best. Okay, they're very expensive to build, and I know they're not proliferating them at a pace which would easily be replenished, so they're going to go to the next best thing, which is nuclear. And of course, the Israelis have tactical nuclear weapons at their disposal, and indeed, Iran is going to make a break for nuclear weapons now. It's undeniable. When I talked yesterday about the Iranians wanting 60% uranium enrichment for leverage, okay, the leverage was that if the West continues and maintains sanctions and can't broker a deal, that the threat is going to be that we're going to make nuclear weapons. Nobody is naive to that. That's the whole point of leverage. It's a tacit threat that we will get nuclear weapons if we can't reach a deal. And that was an attempt to force the West's hand, who only knows power. That's the only thing they respect. So this was their strategy. Now, of course, that backfired. They either should have just kept their mouth shut about it, done it in secret, or just went all the way and developed a nuclear bomb. That's the only thing that could have prohibited this attack from ever happening. But if Israel is going to be getting a strategic bomber, which I would not necessarily put it past the United States to permit something like that, and essentially it's a false dichotomy because at that level, especially considering that you need trained pilots to fly those things, it would be a U.S. pilot in the cockpit flying on behalf of Israel. It would just be a semantics game at that point. So do I suspect that this is going to happen? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. They already have F-35s, so they could drop a tactical nuke in Iran if it's true that they are evading Iranian air defense, unless Iran has been able to get it together. And then maybe it's not going to be such a open sky for the Israelis. According to the Pentagon, they say that U.S. and Israeli strikes have obliterated key nuclear sites. However, many experts are claiming otherwise. And of course, this is something that Trump claimed at the same time that the attack was happening, or within a couple hours of it happening, if you recall. And there could have never been confirmation at that point in time that the attack was successful. Even if they had something within the bomb that told them the depth that it was detonated at, or you can never be too sure, because the inner blueprints of these facilities, a lot of it was secret. So people talk about, the ventilation shaft and it just went straight down, but these ventilation shafts are built to attenuate the blast of a bomb, so they're built with all kinds of right angles, and what it might appear to look like on the surface is certainly not what is happening in the mountain complex below. Trump calls the damage total, but as I've indicated on the channel before, first they said it was obliterated, then Hegseth started to use language like decimated, and then they use language like entombed, or what was the actual terminology? I can't remember what it was, but they basically went from obliterated to decimated, which means to reduce by a factor of 10%, to entombed. Okay, so these are three distinct things. Entombed, all that means is that you need to excavate it. Now, could the facilities have, if they were not properly maintained, could that contribute to some sort of runaway effect? I'm not sure how these centrifuges work underneath there, what sort of maintenance systems are required to make sure that some radiological catastrophe doesn't unfold, but I'm sure that the Iranians had a plan for evacuating that facility, if they even did evacuate it entirely, right? So we also continue to have deployments at Diego Garcia. We still have a lot of B-52s, a lot of F-15s and KC-135s. We're not currently seeing the massive mobilization of Stratotankers, which would signify a major U.S. attack. But of course, the Israelis could be doing a lot of things in secret. And indeed, if this was a top secret military mission, we likely wouldn't see these things on flight radar. And I think this is something that's important for people to comprehend, is that when the big attack comes that is not just Pyrrhic in nature and for public consumption for PR purposes, it's very likely you're not going to see any of the planes on flight radar, just like you didn't see the stealth bombers on flight radar. U.S. cargo planes are arriving en masse to prepare for expanded Middle Eastern conflicts. And yeah, that's pretty much what's going on in the Middle East. Now, switching to Azerbaijan, which of course plays a role in this, and this is kind of the nexus of where East meets West, where North meets South. And so the pathway, it's been determined, of a lot of the attacks on Iran came from the Caspian Sea through Azerbaijan, which in recent years has historically been a tentative ally of the Russians, okay? And so now that Azerbaijan is clearly working in cahoots with the Israelis, and there's a lot of turmoil between Azerbaijan and Russia right now that we'll talk about in just a moment, this is really starting to clearly now delineate and essentially strengthen the relationship between the Russians and the Iranians. Of course, the Russians have access to the Caspian Sea. Should this soft underbelly of the Russian Empire, be it the Iranian coastline here in the Caspian Sea, should that be compromised and thrown into disarray, or be ruled by some puppet NATO regime, then that is going to really be potentially an existential risk for Russia. So in terms of what is going on with Azerbaijan, we know that they used Azeri airspace for Israeli strikes on Iran. We know that the Mossad is operating via Baku. Fuel traces from Israeli jets are found in northwestern Iran. Now, there's a lot of Azerbaijan people in this part of the country, I am told, and at least at this point in time, the risk of any sort of secession or any desire to not be a part of Iran is quite low. Okay, the Iranians, while not a monolith, are still quite unified under the Persian or Iranian auspices. However, that is something that's important to keep in mind, that there's a lot of people who do have some dual allegiances to Azerbaijan, who is now effectively a NATO proxy. Okay, they're removing Russian from schools and they're aiming to cut Moscow's influence. So we see a new tripartite axis developing in the Caucasus, with Turkey, Azerbaijan, and Armenia agreeing to exclude Russia from the Zangezur corridor plans. Now, I believe there is a plan to pump natural gas from the Caspian Sea all the way up through Europe. And of course, the duplicitous Turks can't be trusted, even with Turkstream. And so they're clearly not going to be trusted here. And no matter what Erdogan says, they are not at odds with the Israelis. If anything, they'll probably, fight on behalf of the Israelis when Egypt enters the war and when this thing with Iran really starts to kick off. We really will see where the sleeping dogs lie, okay? So, yeah, that's what's essentially going on there. And there's, Ukrainian influence there. Of course, that is right on Russia's southern border. So it's very problematic. So we could very well see at some point the Russians take a side in the Israeli-Iranian conflict. And I think, at least geostrategically speaking, despite the fact that there is that Jewish diaspora who speak Russian inside Israel, and there is a Russian equivalent of AIPAC who influences heavily Russian foreign policy, I suspect that just the geostrategic aspect of this Middle Eastern conflict will have them siding with the Iranians more and more. And I would suspect that part of the reason why the airspace is closed is that maybe the Kremlin tipped off the Iranians that, hey, they're planning something, watch out, okay? That's just a hunch. Now, let's see what else we got to talk about here. I think we talked about the Middle East. And let me just see here. Okay, shall we move on? I'm not sure if you guys seen this massive explosion. This is another weapons facility. I believe this is in the occupied territories, but this is one of the biggest ones I've seen in some time. So you see that massive blast wave. And this is stuff that is happening on an ongoing basis. People think that the war in Ukraine is going to end because the U.S. is going to stop supplying weapons. Once again, this is all just nonsense to craft a narrative. The fact of the matter is, all that's going to happen is a type of shell game whereby the Ukrainians end up buying the weapons from the Europeans, or buying in the sense that they're donated the weapons from the Europeans who are going to get them from the US. So, nothing's going to change fundamentally on the front lines. The US is still flying planes in the Black Sea, scouting manned planes, and also the RQ-4 Global Hawk unmanned drones in the region, doing ISR gathering for the Ukrainians, which of course have been day after day attempting to blow up the Crimean Bridge. That's the US who is helping them try to do that. So, all of this talk, Elon Musk tweeted out something the other day about how I got to give Trump credit where credit is due because he's ending all these wars and he's the deal maker. And then I responded to that, and it got, I don't know, more views than I usually get on X, in the 100,000 range. And I basically said, look, with respect to Russia-Ukraine, the war is only getting worse, okay? Now NATO is going to be upping its military spend to 5%. That's only going to antagonize the Russians even more. Trump building a golden dome and trying to weaponize space is only going to antagonize the Russians more. A deal wasn't struck in 24 hours, and it won't be struck in 24 months. So that war is still ongoing. In terms of the claim to fame of stopping the Pakistani-India war, well, for starters, I think that anybody in the White House would have had an equal chance at stopping that conflict, okay? There's a myriad of ways you can go about that, even though the Indians claim that the United States had nothing to do with it. Regardless, I mean, again, it's one of those conflicts that probably could have been mediated by a lot of administrations. There is nothing unique to Trump's negotiation style, and that's just a fact. In terms of ending the Iranian war, well, let's not forget that the war started on his watch, and it's not ended. There's been no formal agreement or armistice signed. This is a ceasefire. This is a pause initiated by the instigating side because they needed to replenish their air defense. That's all it is, okay? In terms of brokering a Gaza ceasefire, okay, how many of those have been brokered? 10, 12? How many have been violated? Pretty much every single one. In terms of the mitigating the war between Congo and Rwanda, again, that is sketchy. Most people don't know what that conflict's about. I'm not an expert on the conflict, but it appears to me just to be a big shiny object that is used to detract from the fact that none of the major wars have ended. China has been basically deemed public enemy number one. So every war, major war, that has global repercussions, substantial ones, is intensifying. So the idea that Trump is brokering all these peace deals is just bullshit. It's not happening. Everything is getting worse, okay? Now, let's move up to Russia and Ukraine. Now, this is interesting. I talked about this briefly in a video. I think I might have made reference to it yesterday. But a new object has been cataloged. This is a satellite that apparently has been trailing U.S. military satellites, and it's a Russian satellite. And apparently it released several objects. It seems as though several objects have separated from the Russian Inspector satellite Cosmos 2558, launched in August of 2022, of course, after the war had started. has been a co-planar with USA-326 and presumably making long-distance observations of it. The two earlier satellites of the same type also released sub-satellites. Both of those sub-satellites showed significant maneuvering capability and each fired a high-speed projectile that was interpreted by the Pentagon as an anti-satellite weapon. This happened when they were flying in the vicinity of other Russian satellites. The Russian satellite, or Russian inspector satellites, and their passengers are part of a project called Nivelier, which I described in these articles. Okay, so of course this is to do with the weaponization of space. There's a lot that we don't know that's going on up there, and so this is why people really need to pay attention to this Golden Dome thing when this bill passes, because that is going to be a shadow war that we're not going to see, but we're potentially going to feel, because of course it's these satellites that are being used to effectively do deep strikes inside of Russia. Now, a lot of that is reliant on AI nowadays, but to have that real-time satellite feed is obviously something that is very useful and contentious. And for that reason, we're likely going to see space-based warfare intensify. And the Russians are basically showing here that we can take out your satellites from space using maneuverable projectiles that are released from satellites, as opposed to needing an S-500 fancy-dancy system that can shoot down satellites from the ground, which they've already demonstrated they could do prior to the Ukraine war's inception. So this is very serious stuff which is developing here. Again, the war in Ukraine is only intensifying. I could show you thousands of videos of things blowing up there on a day-to-day basis. I mean, this was one of the bigger attacks that happened just a few days ago. These are the flight paths of Shahed drones in Ukraine that were fired in a major attack. I believe this one was 550 drones. And these drone strikes are only going to continue. I mean, there's whole ecosystems developing with just the first-person view drones with the fiber optic cables. It's like the forests are turning into these fiber optic spider webs because, you know, they use the cable so they aren't susceptible to electronic warfare and things like jamming. But that's creating a whole new environmental issue on top of what's going on. This is interesting news. This is from Polish media. In the event of mobilization or war, draft notices in Poland will now be delivered by couriers. Okay, so they're not going to be delivered by the military per se. They're just going to be, you're going to get something from FedEx that says, hey, get your ass to the front line. Poland's Ministry of Defense has announced new regulations under updated rules. Official summons will be delivered by special couriers. Refusal to comply with such obligations could result in long-term imprisonment. So they're getting people ready for the draft. The UK is going to be supplying up to 10 times the amount of drones to Ukraine in the coming months ahead. And of course, Ukraine itself is going to be mass producing these drones as well as long-range ballistic missiles. Now, there are rumors that Taurus missiles have already been used in Ukraine. And I think this was derived from something that the new chancellor had said. And of course, it's total speculation. But what we know about NATO weapon shipments to Ukraine is that they typically always try to keep things at parity for the sake of not overstepping the boundaries with the Russians. So if the Ukrainians are deprived Patriot missiles, they will try to give them something else to compensate for that deficiency, to try to bring them up to the same amount of fighting power, which could mean empowering them with these Taurus missiles to do deeper strikes behind Russian lines. Now, we know also that every time a new weapon has been introduced, with the exception of tanks, I think, and even those, you don't really hear about them until they're already there in operation. That was the case with the Storm Shadow. We found out about the Storm Shadow missiles being used while they were being used, okay, and after they were being used, in fact. So these things arrive there long before it's ever disclosed that they're there. And this makes perfect sense. And the European nations have also made a point about a year or so ago that they were not going to be openly as transparent about the types of weapons that they were sending to Ukraine, which would make perfect sense if this was a real war. But of course, this is fifth dimensional warfare on top of that, so it involves a lot of skullduggery in the media and trying to gain the element of surprise. There was a car bomb in central Moscow today which killed a senior FSB general. Now, we don't know who exactly that was. Some were suspecting that they had the name of the individual, but nonetheless, sabotage continues on a daily basis. There are rumors, once again, just rumors, that NATO is already operational in the Odessa region and that NATO may move on Odessa, and that perhaps this is what the call with Emmanuel Macron was with Vladimir Putin today. Again, anytime that you see a unusual olive branch extended, or at least how that's painted by the media, that Macron reaches out to Putin to try to broker some sort of deal, I guarantee you that that's a veiled threat and it's a sign that things are going to escalate. In fact, I recall, was it back in 2022 when Putin was talking to Macron and he says, sorry, I got to go play hockey or something to that effect. And then, of course, we know what transpired. Okay, things got really heated after that. And remember that Macron was the one who was threatening to, hand out nuclear weapons to other countries, put troops inside Ukraine. So Macron is no friend of Vladimir Putin. And in fact, I think him reaching out to Putin is a suggestion that indeed we're about to see some big moves being made. There are more rumors of a pending offensive in the Sumy region, because as I've reported on the channel in the past, the Russians want to create a buffer zone, which would basically create a border between, let's see if I have a map here of what's going on in Ukraine. I guess I can use flight radar. They want to create a buffer zone to basically prevent, so this is where the countries meet. You're probably not going to be able to make heads or tails of this. Oh, that's Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan kind of looks, it's kind of the same shape as Ukraine, only way bigger. Okay, yeah, so, basically from, Belgorod up to the northern part of the country where the Belarusian border, this is all, open border between Ukraine and Russia. So they want to create some kind of buffer zone here, which would mean, of course, the Russians having a, artillery presence or something to prevent any incursions into this territory. And the best way to do that is to just invade Sumy and, kind of close this gap here between Kharkov and Belarus. And that is what is factoring in, that there's going to be a big offensive by the Russians. And the West is saying, if you do that, then we're going to put troops in Odessa. And that is going to be the tripwire for Article 5, potentially. That's kind of how I understand it, although there's many different interpretations of it. North Korea is alleging to be getting ready to send 30,000 troops to bolster Russia's forces in anticipation of this major offensive. And that, of course, is going to trigger the West and be used as leverage when trying to mobilize for war. European countries, that is, the North Koreans are invading Europe, right? That's what they're going to say. And there's going to be some truth to that, for sure. NATO is formalizing arms transfers by buying U.S. weapons for Kiev, counting the spending under NATO's new 5% GDP defense threshold. What else do we got going on here? Germany is going all in on war mobilization. So they're going to be drastically expanding their armaments production. And they want nukes. I think I've talked about that in the past. The Chinese have unveiled some new thing they call a graphite bomb, but apparently it's old tech. Like a lot of these things these ideas were cooked up during the Star Wars era, and now they're being resurrected because, of course, we're in a new Cold War. A non-lethal weapon designed to black out electrical grids. It disperses carbon filaments over power stations, short-circuiting infrastructure. It debuted via state animation amid Taiwan tension. I believe there have been triple the average amounts of incursions as of late into Taiwanese airspace by China. So keep your eyes on what's going on there. Chinese activity around Taiwan is very high at this point in time. And of course, China is rapidly selling off U.S. treasuries and continues to buy gold. There is an inverse relationship with the amount of treasuries they are holding and the purchasing of gold, which remains and seems to have found a floor at the 3,300 level. It's basically looking as though, knock on wood, it is here to stay. A lot of market indicators are flashing red. I was talking to the rebel capitalist, George Gammon, today, who's going to give his insights into what's happening on the macroeconomic spectrum. And we're going to be releasing that video tomorrow, I suspect. So stay tuned for that. The markets are at all-time highs. Basically, Berkshire Hathaway and Warren Buffett are withering away, wondering what the hell is going on, because the Buffett indicator is higher than it's ever been before in history, which is insane that we are once again at record highs in terms of the markets. And all that really means is that those unjustified valuations, it's most certainly not a risk-on environment, no matter how you slice it, considering the deficit spending, which is almost guaranteed at this point to increase. The fact that the Fed wants to lower rates, or Trump wants the Fed to lower rates to stimulate more spending. The debt is, higher than it's ever been before. What are the other? The dollar has lost more value since the beginning of this year, since it has since 1973. So everything's flashing red, and it's just a matter of, keeping yourself prepared and ready. Now, just to give people a bit of a sense of where we're going with this whole Canadian prepper thing, the prepper news thing, I realize that having a homestead isn't something which is in the cards for a lot of people. And the more I become accustomed to the off-grid homestead life, I can quite frankly say that it is not for most people. Okay, it is a lot of work, and for every 1 minute of tranquility at the end of the day, you've invested 10 minutes of grueling labor in order to get there. So it's important to understand that just because you don't have some off-grid retreat paradise doesn't mean that you're not going to be able to ride out the worst of worst case scenarios. In fact, I would say that for the majority of people, one of the best solutions is going to be just to get some small plot of land in the middle of butt crack nowhere. It's probably not going to cost you that much, because there's a lot of land you can buy off the beaten path, 10 acres or something like that. And obviously this is not something that you're going to be able to just walk down to the bank and, get a loan for. But it's achievable for most people if you work hard and you save some money in terms of buying a small patch of land in the middle of nowhere. It doesn't really, the land that's expensive that everybody's referencing is the stuff around the cities that everybody else is chasing. As a prepper, as a rule of thumb, you're going for the places that are least sought after, okay? And you get yourself maybe a cheap camping trailer, you get yourself a shipping container full of stuff, you park it there, or if you're worried about security, those things are actually pretty secure. They can be broken into, especially in the middle of nowhere where people have nothing but time to break into it. But you could have a system whereby you had one of these shipping containers at the ready with a bunch of preps in it, ready to go, ready to bug out. Now, the question is, are we going to get to that point where you have to bug out away from people? And it is possible. That is the worst of worst case scenarios. Some people say, well, I never want to live in that scenario. But you will. You will still want to live, and you won't want your family to die unless you're some kind of pushover, which I don't think most preppers are. Most certainly, if you're watching this channel, you want to survive. You want an edge. And so, I'm not saying this. I make no money by saying this to you, that you should do this, and the things that you should invest in for that are not things that are lucrative for me to promote to you. I'm talking about, beans and rice in Mylar bags, ammo that I don't sell. A lot of these things are things that I don't sell. Shipping containers I don't sell. But this is a solution that you might want to consider, in the very least, is we talk about the bug out vehicle, but consider the bug out shipping container, something that is drag and drop, that you could maybe at a moment's notice, if you had a bit of a heads up, if you suspect that things are really escalating, maybe a nuke goes off, you get that sucker transported out into the boonies by somebody you trust, or rent a truck and get it dropped off. You have your camping trailer, someplace for you to ride out the worst of the worst. Because if we're talking about a full-on grid-down predicament, going off grid and having a homestead, and I'm just trying to provide people with solutions here that don't involve spending $1 million on an off-grid property, and that's what it's going to cost you. At the end of the day, if you want to do it with any measure of normalcy or convenience in a way that's not going to drive you and your family insane, because if you grew up in the city your entire life, it's going to cost you $1 million. Now, can you do it cheaper and do it more gradually and do it in a way which is more thrifty? Yeah, you can. But when all is said and done, when you add up the equipment, the solar, the water pumps, planting trees, things of that nature, it's going to cost you a lot of money, okay? So I realize that that's not in the cards for a lot of people. The next best thing is to have an Plan B property, which could be a cabin. Typically, cabins, cottages, as we call them, are places that are almost the cost of houses nowadays, because they're surrounding a lake, and then you got to deal with the people at the lake, right? You don't know who your neighbors are. And then, of course, you have to deal with all the, potential refugees and passer-throughs who are going to pose a risk in that situation. So the next best thing is to find a piece of land, or to look at the public land offerings. Most places, crown land, 90% of land in Canada is crown land, meaning that, the king owns it, essentially. And you can squat on it legally for 28 days. But if we're talking full-blown SHTF, nobody's going to care. Nobody's going to find you anyways. So having a plan of maybe a camping trailer and a truck to pull it, that could be where you store most of your provisions, Having a big bug out plan, having a bug out bag is good if you're just planning on getting somewhere. We're going to be doing an inch bag video. Honestly, the purpose of the inch bag video is to discourage people from doing it. If you don't know what that is, it's an I'm never coming home bag. What would you need if, if you could only bring the stuff on your back to survive indefinitely in the post-apocalyptic wasteland? What would you bring? Well, that's the video we're going to attempt to do. We're going to be consulting with experts that we've had on the channel, winners or finalists from the show alone, to see what their perspective on it. What would they bring, right? If they could only bring maybe 120 pounds of gear in a hiking trailer or something. It's going to be an interesting mental exercise anyways. But what I'm trying to say is that there are ways, and I'm going to throw out a number. People get scared by these numbers, but this is just a fact of life, okay? I would say that depending on the price of the land, I can't speak to the price of the land because that can range from $10,000 to $1 million. If you were just gonna go retreat on some forestry, back road, public land, crown land that is owned by the Queen, then you're not gonna have any problems with private landowners after SHTF trying to kill you, okay? You'll still have to contest with other people for that property, but it's much less likely that they're going to put up a fight than if it was somebody who owned that land. Now, assuming that you can get yourself a decent camping trailer and you can have a truck, you probably need something that you can pull that with, obviously. You could probably do something like this for $10,000, enough to kind of get you situated. Okay, now I'm not saying you need to go and do this. I'm just saying, if we go full-blown Mad Max, you're going to have a plan like this. And that is going to be something that is obtainable. I'm not saying you're going to be able to go down today. I understand People are pressed for cash. I get that. I'm not saying this is something you just do overnight, but this is an achievable goal, and it's as good as it's going to get. It's not going to get any cheaper than that. If you're talking about storing a month's worth of food in a mobile platform that can take you to a place that's free of threats. Now, people are going to say, well, yeah, you shouldn't leave the city. Oh, yeah, you should leave the city. Because if there ain't no supply chain, if there ain't no water pumping through the taps, if there's no electricity, if there's no heat in the high-rise buildings or, air conditioning in the high-rise buildings, if there's no law and order, I mean, it is just going to be reduced to a cesspool of violence and debauchery. And if you want a good sense of how it's going to be, many of you might be familiar with Selko, but I believe he was the guy who survived the Serbian crisis, the Bosnian crisis. And he talked about how when the city was being surrounded, that basically it came down to, gangs ruling. And so if you think you can survive and endure in that environment, and if you're going to be able to defend and you're going to have a sizable enough group, you live in a gated community and everybody has comprehensive firearms training and you can work together as a team, then yeah, maybe you could defend your block or defend your property. But if you're somebody who doesn't get on well with your neighbors, then you do need an evacuation plan that accounts for these kind of things, okay? So having a good bug-out vehicle that can carry a lot of stuff, having a trailer that can carry a lot of stuff, that is really what you're looking at. And obviously, ideally, you would have a place already in motion. You would have trees already planted. That's one thing I would recommend. If you do get a property, that the first thing you do is you go and plant some fruit trees, because those things are going to take years to grow, okay? So if you want to have a regenerative food supply when you get there that can supplement your potatoes or whatever you decide to grow through subsistence, hunting or farming, then you're going to want to have done those things in advance. And that's no easy task unto itself, which is why I'm not advising people to uproot their lives and go off grid anymore. And I don't know if I ever really did do that. I never give people directive advice, because of course it's kind of like giving people financial advice. But I will say that you should have a plan to evacuate the city. And most people who will complain about the cost of these things, they also have very frivolous spending habits when it comes to other things. So, I mean, if you're one of those people who has season tickets to, or you find yourself going to baseball games or, things that cost like hundreds of dollars, and then you're complaining about the cost of having an insurance policy, if the worst of the worst happens, then maybe your priorities aren't exactly straight. But it's important to understand that in framing the cost of these things. And then, of course, it's also dual purpose in that it's a potential retreat. It's a recreational, there's recreational aspects to having some off-grid property like that. In fact, a lot of these properties are classified as recreational properties that you would go to for hunting or things of that nature. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below with respect to all of this stuff, and stay vigilant, but try to enjoy the summer. Summer's here. This is as good as it's going to get in Canada. So enjoy the next, 45 days or so until the days start getting shorter and things start getting cooler. I know my greenhouse right now is just bustling. It is blooming, man. It is a jungle in there. I can't wait to show you guys the results. Anyways, guys, I got to get going here, but thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and go check out the Canadian Prepper YouTube channel if you want more actionable advice. Thanks for watching. Take care.